The coastal winds rolled over Fogveil Training Base, dragging mist off the ocean and sweeping it across the long-distance range like a slow-moving curtain. Beyond the metal bleachers and auto-tracking stations, the range stretched outward in bands of colorless dirt, stone berms, and distant steel targets blinking under drone-synced light sensors. It was here, just beyond Range Line 7, that Lieutenant Brant Halden first saw something that made him stop cold in his boots. A man, old, gray-bearded, and calm as a stone in tidewater, sat on a plain wooden stool with a bolt-action rifle laid across his lap. But it wasn't the man's age or posture that drew Brant's attention. It was the rifle itself, painted in flat, matte blue, almost like a child's crayon rendering of a gun. The tone clashed violently with the sleek blacks and grays of modern military weaponry. Its edges were hand-sanded. The barrel showed signs of custom machining. There were no digital mounts, no data uplinks, no thermal overlays. Just raw craftsmanship and odd defiance. What the hell is that? Brant muttered to himself. He adjusted his belt, squared his shoulders, and approached. As he neared, the low murmur of snickering recruits floated through the air. A few stood behind the man, whispering to each other like schoolboys spotting something weird on a field trip. One leaned toward another and said, maybe he brought his grandson's paintball gun by mistake. A round of chuckles followed. Brant's jaw tightened. The man didn't react. His name patch, half covered by a tan scarf, read, T. Callan. His hat was frayed at the edges. His boots were stitched with care. He sat motionless, staring downrange, as if time itself moved differently around him. There was no fear. No tensión. Just stillness. So complete it unsettled Brant more than a verbal challenge ever could. This is a live-fire range, sir, Brant began, pitching his voice into what he imagined was firm but polite authority. Only active duty and approved personnel are authorized during this window. I'm going to have to ask you to relocate. Callan didn't turn, didn't blink. He simply let the words hang in the salty air and fall uselessly to the ground. Brant's nostrils flared. Sir, he repeated a bit sharper now, this is part of tactical CERT week. We're running precision drills. That paint job piece isn't even registered with the system. You're interfering with still nothing. Dramatic irony thickened in the background. Every second the man didn't speak, the younger soldiers grew bolder in their mockery. Private Merrick Ron, stocky and freckled, leaned forward and tapped his buddy on the chest plate. He probably thinks it's still 1975, he said with a grin. Maybe he's out here chasing ghosts. Another laugh rippled through the group, but even as they snickered, a few of the older instructors on the higher platforms began to notice the gathering. Sergeant Danner Kroll, a 25-year veteran turned civilian marksman evaluator, adjusted his scope and looked again. His eyes narrowed, not at the rifle's strange color, but at its shape, the build, the angle of the cheek weld, the bolt configuration. Something about it pried at an old memory he hadn't thought about in years. Brant stepped closer, now standing over the old man. The shadow of his fatigues cast long across the rifle's blue surface. I'm not going to ask again, he said, his tone drifting from official to irritated. Pack it up. Whatever this is, you're not cleared. At that, Callan slowly reached into a battered leather pouch. Not rushed, not defiant, just deliberate. The motion was so smooth that it silenced the last wave of jokes. He retrieved a laminate ID, worn, sun-faded, yet crisp where it mattered, and held it out like an offering from another world. Brant took it without thanks. As his eyes scanned the laminate, he hesitated. T. Callan. Clearance. Civilian Tactical Consultant. Unrestricted range access. Tier D. Valid through 2031. Brant's jaw ticked. He flipped the card over, hoping to find a glitch, a scratch, a forgery. Nothing. Every box was valid. He'd expected to call security and get the man quietly escorted off. Instead, the man held more range authority than Brant did himself. Brant handed it back stiffly. Fine, he muttered, but stay off our targeting line. That rifle, whatever it is, looks like a hazard. Still no reply. Instead, Callan gently rested his hands over the painted blue stock like it was sacred. The wind brushed against him, And behind the glass of the range tower, Sergeant Kroll turned, picked up his secure range radio, and said quietly into the mic, "We might have a ghost on the range." Private First Class Merrick Ron balanced his elbow on the shooting bench rail and flicked his sunglasses up just enough to see the old man again. "You think he got that thing off a fishing boat?" He asked no one in particular, his voice just loud enough to carry. The others chuckled. One leaned forward and said, "Looks like he dipped it in pool paint." Merrick pointed toward the dull blue bolt-action rifle and added, "Maybe he thinks it's a flare gun, for when the war comes back to shore." The laughter bounced across the concrete like a misfired round. But Tibor Callan didn't move. He sat as still as ever, staring downrange through air that shimmered with coastal haze. His fingers, knotted with age, rested gently across the receiver of the rifle. His posture wasn't stiff like a statue. It was relaxed, like a man who'd been here 1,000 times before and needed no proof of belonging. Lieutenant Brant Halden clenched his jaw. The man's silence felt like a personal insult. Around him, the other recruits and junior officers had stopped their own calibration work to watch the scene unfold. A few chuckled. A few stayed quiet. But they all waited for Brant to handle it, and he knew it. He stepped closer again, louder this time. "You're occupying a certified line during an active precision qualification," he barked. "And that's not regulation gear." He gestured curtly at the rifle, as if disgusted. "You're not using ballistic relay sync. There's no ID tag on that scope, and that paint is a reflective hazard. This isn't a gun show or a weekend rec shoot. This is military training. Get off the line before I escalate." Still, Callan didn't look at him. Behind them, Sergeant Danner Kroll stood half-shadowed in the tower. He narrowed his eyes and began scrolling on his ancient, access-restricted tablet, something he'd been issued years ago for legacy files. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd seen that rifle before. No, not just the rifle, that shade of blue. It pulled at his memory like a hook under the ribs. It reminded him of something from decades ago, a deep-dive weapons briefing tucked into the archives of a mission few dared mention. Something involving a man who made a rifle sing in conditions no machine would tolerate. Meanwhile, Merrick Ron, emboldened by Brant's tone, stepped even closer. "Sir," he said mockingly, "do you even know what a 4,200-meter target is?" He pointed to the farthest silhouette visible through the distortion of the mist. "Because we're about to run live AI scope sync trials on thermal blended targets. This isn't your backyard shooting range." Brant gave a tight nod of agreement and crossed his arms. "That thing," he said, gesturing again at the rifle, "has no place on this line. You're a safety hazard, a distraction." Callan moved, but not in the way they expected. He didn't stand. He didn't speak. He simply reached down with slow precision, opened a small leather-bound notebook that rested beside his bag, and placed it next to the scope of the rifle. The pages fluttered briefly in the breeze, but inside were neat hand-drawn charts, not printed grids, not digital readouts, but calculations. Wind drift tables, range estimations, curvature adjustments, all handwritten. The recruit stared. "Is he for real?" Merrick mumbled. "Like analog?" Brant's lip curled. "That's it." He turned sharply and keyed his radio mic. "Base range control. This is Halden on line 7. I have an unauthorized civilian who... Negative, Lieutenant." A voice cut across the frequency, low and gravelly. "That civilian is authorized. Do not interfere further." Brant blinked. "Identify." "Sergeant Danner Kroll. Acting range safety lead. He's not a civilian. He's Mr. Callan. Leave him be." For a moment, Brant stood frozen, unsure what rattled him more, the sudden override or the dead certainty in Kroll's voice. Behind him, Merrick scoffed quietly. "He still looks like a lawn gnome with a cosplay gun." But as Merrick reached forward and gave the edge of the blue rifle's stock a single poke, just a careless tap, the atmosphere shifted. Callan's eyes, which had until now been distant and peaceful, suddenly locked onto Merrick's with a stare so sharp, so ancient, it sliced through time. It wasn't anger. It was something far colder, older, a silence packed with memory. For a flash, the world around them seemed to shift, as if the mist from the coastline parted, and behind Callan appeared the outline of sandbags, old field tents, and a wet concrete floor reeking of cordite. Brant saw it. Merrick saw it. They didn't understand it, but they felt it. Kroll, still watching from the tower, stopped breathing. That look, that stillness. It wasn't civilian. It wasn't confused old age. It was the calm of someone who had once taken a shot with lives depending on it and didn't miss. Brant swallowed. He didn't yet know what they'd just disturbed, but for the first time that morning, a kernel of unease settled in his gut. The recruits still laughed, but quieter now. Callan said nothing, but the storm had begun to form. Sergeant Danner Kroll stood inside the Fogveil Range watchtower, his calloused fingers gripping the edge of the observation rail as he stared down at the old man with the painted rifle. The recruits' laughter below echoed faintly through the glass panes, but Kroll heard none of it. His heartbeat drowned everything out. He had seen that rifle before, not in person, but in grainy old mission briefs stamped with clearance levels most soldiers would never rise high enough to even hear about. The blue paint wasn't decorative. It wasn't childish. It was a signature, a signal, a mark that only one man had ever used on a battlefield. His pulse quickened. No, it can't be him. He'd be too old. He'd be retired. Gone. A ghost by now. But ghosts sometimes return to places where they once rewrote the impossible. He stepped back from a window and unlocked the steel cabinet bolted to the wall. Inside lay a battered military-issue tablet, the kind manufactured before Fogveil Base had even been built. Its casing was dented. The connector pins were scratched, but it held something the modern systems didn't. Archive clearance pathways linked to retired Black Ops codenames. Kroll wiped the screen with the corner of his sleeve and powered it on, watching as an ancient login prompt flickered to life. His hands trembled. He typed the names slowly. Callan, Tiber M. The system paused for a long moment, as if deliberating whether a man like Kroll should be allowed to learn anything at all. Then the screen flashed red. Access restricted. Eyes only. Command tier. Kroll's throat tightened. He wasn't cleared. Not even close. But the tablet gave just enough information to confirm what he feared. This wasn't just some elderly hobbyist with a painted rifle. This was someone whose entire existence remained sealed behind layers of classification older than most soldiers on the base. Down below, Lieutenant Brant Halden gestured angrily, his hands slicing through the air as he lectured Callan. The young recruits stood nearby, still smirking, still believing the situation was humorous, still blind. Kroll slammed the cabinet shut. He pulled out his secure range radio. His voice dropped to a gravelly whisper, not out of fear, but respect. "Range control, this is Sergeant Kroll," he said. "I need a direct channel to command liaison immediately." Static crackled, then a clipped reply. "Kroll, confirm urgency?" He hesitated. Then he said the words no one else dared. "We may have an operative Polaris identification on site." Silence. A silence heavier than any gunfire. Then standby. Kroll's skin went cold. He had not said that name, Operative Polaris, in 20 years. It wasn't a code name. It was a myth. A whisper. A story instructors told in quiet bars after deployments when bragging rights turned into confession. Polaris wasn't a soldier. Polaris was a phenomenon. A sniper who could disappear into wind and light. A man whose missions were so improbable the documents looked like fiction. Some said he'd once held off an armored column using nothing but a rifle he built in the field. Others claimed he fired through fog so dense drones couldn't see 2 feet forward. Yet he made a shot over 4 kilometers away. Kroll had thought those were exaggerations. But that rifle, that stillness, that silence, they matched every myth. He turned back to the window. Callan was still seated, unmoved by Brant's threats, unmoved by Merrick Ron's mockery. His hands rested on the rifle like a pianist waiting for the moment between notes. Like a soldier remembering the breath before a shot that changed a war. The radio beeped again. "Kroll, this is Command Liaison. Your report is escalated. Colonel Wren is being notified. Maintain visual. Do not engage. Do not approach. Do not let anyone lay hands on him." Kroll exhaled shakily. "Understood." He stepped back to the window, just in time to see Merrick Ron poke the rifle stock again. A simple, careless tap, yet it made Callan's eyes sharpen with the kind of cold, ancient clarity only a handful of survivors ever carried. A clarity built in the dark corners of missions no one admitted existed. Kroll whispered to himself, "You kids have no idea what you've touched." The mist outside thickened, rolling in from the coastline like a warning veil. In the tower, Kroll made one last call, this time to someone even higher. "Get the convoy ready," he said quietly. "If it's really him, they'll want boots on the ground." Below, Callan finally adjusted the bolt of his rifle with a soft click. It was the quietest sound on the range, and somehow the loudest warning. In the command liaison office perched 2 floors above Fogveil Base's intelligence wing, Lieutenant Commander Derek Vaughn sat hunched over a flickering terminal, the harsh glow of its screen reflecting off the silver frame of his reading glasses. He wasn't a man prone to superstition, but something about the message that had just arrived made his fingers pause mid-type. The subject line from the range tower read simply, "Possible visual ID, T. Callan. Request immediate clearance cross-check." He'd seen strange alerts before, usually mix-ups, sometimes pranks. But the name made his spine prickle. He opened the secure personnel registry. It asked for 3 levels of authentication, then a rotating cipher key. He entered each one without blinking. The result made his stomach drop. File locked, classification, eyes only, command tier 7+. His fingers froze over the desk. That level of clearance wasn't just unusual, it was sacred ground. Tier 7 was for full bird colonels and up. The kind of people who whispered policy into dark rooms and watched wars from behind satellite feeds. Vaughn, a commander, wasn't even tier 4. And yet here was a live subject, not a ghost file, not a memorial, pinging the system from the rifle range. He leaned back and stared at the monitor. Tiber Callan. The name rang in his ears like a half-forgotten ballad. He'd heard it before, deep in a closed briefing years ago, during a joint advisory with veteran ops on doctrine development. Callan had been mentioned once, not in glowing terms, but in hushed, almost fearful ones. As if speaking the name too loudly might summon something none of them were equipped to understand. Operative Polaris. A legend. A phantom. Not officially listed in any single campaign. No myths. No photos. Just a code name linked to a half-dozen impossible operations scattered across continents and decades. Vaughn searched again, this time in a forgotten partition of the base's offline archive. There, hidden beneath layers of obfuscation, he found it, a decrypted flashpoint brief, labeled Polaris, last known deployment. It showed a mission schematic from a long-erased coastal conflict. The notes were fragmented, but 2 things stood out. Prototype rifle, Marlin 1. Hand-machined, painted matte blue for oceanic recovery visibility. Confirmed kill distance, 4270 m. Mobile thermal signature under fog inversion. Vaughn's throat went dry. He picked up his encrypted field phone and thumbed the secure line to Colonel Wren's office. "Sir," he said as soon as the line clicked alive, "you're going to want to get down to the range." "Now, another safety drill?" Wren replied. "I'm mid-review." "No, sir. It's Callan. Tiber Callan." Silence. Then, the colonel's voice came back, very quiet. "You're absolutely sure?" "Positive ID. He's here, on the long-range line. Recruits are already engaging with him, badly." There was a pause. "I'm en route." Vaughn set down the receiver and stared again at the line in the report. The man known as Polaris cannot be trained, replaced, or replicated. He is not doctrine. He is exception. Back at the range, Callan still hadn't fired a shot. Lieutenant Halden, still oblivious, paced beside him, arms crossed, occasionally throwing condescending glances at the blue rifle like it was a child's toy left in the sand. "Your little museum piece is slowing down real-time telemetry trials," he said dryly. "We got 6 squads waiting to test the new auto rangefinders. That's what real war fighters use now. Not this bolt-action cosplay." Private Ron chimed in again from the background. "He's probably here on a bet. I'll give him this. He's committed to the act." The men laughed. But one thing was changing: the air. The wind off the Pacific had begun to shift direction. It blew steadily now toward the inland cliffs, dragging cool mist over the range, obscuring distance, changing pressure, muting sound. And in that shifting silence, Callan finally lifted the bolt of the rifle and checked the chamber. The recruits fell quiet without realizing why. They didn't know that miles away, a military convoy was already rolling down the base's inner perimeter road. At its head was a Humvee flanked by two black-plated SUVs, their tires kicking dust into the morning sky. Inside, Colonel Wren adjusted his watch. Behind him sat someone far more important and far more deadly. Lieutenant Brant Halden stood near the shooting bench, arms folded like a man clinging to authority he didn't know was slipping away. The recruits were still huddled a few paces back, quieter now, but not yet silent. The mist off the coast had thickened and moved inland in waves, making the distant targets shimmer like illusions across the sand. Tiber Callan hadn't moved. He sat on his simple wooden stool like a statue carved from old stone, unbothered by the ridicule, unmoved by the tension. His painted blue rifle rested against his shoulder. His right hand lingered over the bolt with casual intimacy. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. But the silence he carried now had a gravity to it. Private Merrick Ron's earlier swagger had faded. He leaned in toward Halden and muttered, what if this guy's not some fake? Brant didn't respond. His jaw was clenched, his knuckles white where they held his data tablet. And then the sound came. Faint at first. A low vibration, more felt in the feet than heard by the ears. The soft, distant hum of engines. Not standard Humvees. Not routine base traffic. This was different. Faster. Angrier. Brant turned toward the access road at the far edge of the range and squinted into the mist. A dust cloud began to rise behind the ridgeline, rolling upward like a wave about to break. Then, through the veil, came the silhouette of a lead Humvee flanked by two matte black SUVs moving fast. They weren't slowing. They weren't obeying range perimeter protocols. They were coming straight for them. What the hell? Someone muttered. The vehicles roared across the dirt, bypassing the checkpoint altogether. The Humvee skidded to a stop just a yard from the shooting line, kicking up a wave of grit and fog. The SUVs halted in near-perfect formation behind it, their tires drawing trenches into the dust. The doors burst open simultaneously. Out of the front Humvee stepped Colonel Wren, his crisp uniform dusted at the hem, but his expression sharper than a drawn blade. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. But the passenger door of the second SUV opened next, and time seemed to freeze. Out stepped a woman in full formal uniform, her decorations so numerous they seemed to shimmer even in the mist, her single silver star gleaming like a beacon against the gray backdrop. Brigadier General Raylan Voss. Even the wind paused for her. She walked with a calculated intensity, every step landing with weight that decades of command had forged. She didn't look at Brant. She didn't glance at the recruits. Her eyes locked only on the man seated calmly at the shooting bench. Callan didn't move. He watched her approach, not with surprise, but with acknowledgement. A familiarity neither warm nor cold. Just earned. Brant swallowed hard, his throat dry as sand. He stepped back involuntarily, the authority draining from his face. General Voss halted directly in front of the old man and brought her boots together in a sharp, thunderous crack. Then, with a fluid motion that was precise, practiced, and deeply respectful, she raised her arm in a full salute. It wasn't ceremonial. It wasn't polite. It was reverence. Mr. Callan, she said, her voice calm but resonant, carrying across the entire stunned firing line. It is an honor, sir. On behalf of this base and this nation, I apologize for what you've been subjected to. A ripple passed through the crowd. The young recruits stood frozen. Merrick Ron looked like he'd swallowed a bullet. Lieutenant Brant Halden's face had turned ashen. Only Callan moved, slowly rising from the stool, his back straight, posture effortless. He returned a small nod. No words, just a quiet acknowledgement of her gesture. General Voss lowered her hand and turned toward Brant. Her expression changed. The respectful composure hardened into cold steel. "Lieutenant," she said, voice now low and dangerous, "do you have the slightest idea who this man is?" Brant stammered. "I thought he said nothing, ma'am. He didn't identify. He didn't have to," she cut in, taking a single step closer. "Because you were too busy judging the color of his rifle to notice the weight of his presence. You saw an old man, not a war fighter, not a builder of the very doctrine you pretend to understand." She turned and gestured toward the blue rifle. "This weapon changed the future of precision warfare before you were even born." Silence swallowed the range. Behind them, the engines clicked as they cooled. The wind returned, this time carrying only shame and the slow realization of just how badly the young Marines had miscalculated. Tiber Callan reached down and rested one hand lightly on the bench once more. And though he said nothing, everyone knew he had already fired the most devastating shot of the day. For a moment, it was as if Fogveil Range had been swallowed whole by time. No one moved. No one breathed. The crisp echo of General Raylan Voss's salute still hung in the air, reverberating like the aftershock of a cannon blast. Her back remained perfectly straight, arm raised in respect, eyes locked on the man who hadn't fired a single round, yet had stunned every soldier on the line into stillness. The wind rustled the distant flags. The dust finally began to settle, and still, Tiber Callan stood calmly beside the bench, silent and composed. He had not spoken since the morning began. He had not defended himself. He had not demanded respect. And yet, in this quiet moment, the entire base bent toward him like trees to gravity. General Voss slowly lowered her hand. She turned then, sharply, to face Lieutenant Brant Halden, and when her eyes found his, it was as if she had transformed. The warmth with which she greeted the old man was gone, replaced now by the frosted edge of authority wielded with surgical precision. Her voice dropped, controlled, razor-thin. "Lieutenant Halden," she said, "what is the standard operating procedure when a civilian presents a valid Tier D range permit?" Brant opened his mouth, but only a stutter emerged. Ma'am, The answer is, you confirm clearance and you stand down," she replied for him, stepping forward. "You do not mock. You do not escalate. You do not interrogate. And under no circumstances do you allow your subordinates to lay a finger on his equipment." Her tone grew colder. "You failed all of that. And worse, you failed to ask one simple question." Brant swallowed. "Which question, ma'am?" Her eyes narrowed. "Who is he?" Behind her, Colonel Wren folded his arms, saying nothing. His presence was deliberate. It was his base, and yet in this moment, he knew better than to interrupt. General Voss had seized command, not by order, but by the sheer force of truth revealed. She turned slightly, gesturing toward the painted blue rifle resting on the bench. "You mocked that weapon," she said to the crowd now. "Laughed at its color, called it outdated, but you never asked what it was, or what it had done." She glanced toward the watchtower, where Sergeant Kroll stood at attention, expression unreadable. "That is the Marlin one," Voss said, her voice now projecting like a lecture. "A prototype rifle hand-built during a coastal interdiction mission that doesn't officially exist. It has no factory serial number, no digital scope, no automatic fief. It was carved, tuned, and field-tested by a man surviving with one wounded arm and 3 salvage rifle parts. That man was Tiber Callan." Merrick Rom lowered his head. His earlier bravado now looked like a child's mask peeling in the sun. Voss continued, "Callan's longest confirmed hit stands at 4,270 meters. Thermal obscured. Fogveil. Moving target. That record stood for nearly 3 decades, and no AI system has replicated it to this day. He didn't fire that shot with tech. He fired it with patience, with pressure knowledge, with breath discipline, with purpose." She paused, letting that sink in. "Everything you carry today, your sensors, your hybrid scopes, your recoil compensators, those are the grandchildren of this man's improvisation, of this rifle's DNA." Brant looked at Callan now, not with defiance, not with pity, but with dawning comprehension. He was no longer standing in front of an eccentric. He was standing in front of the original blueprint, General Voss turned back to face him directly. "You saw an old man," she said, her voice heavy with disappointment. "You saw a paint job. You saw stillness and assumed irrelevance. But this is the man who taught silence how to kill." She let the words settle like iron filings to the earth. Brant lowered his head. General Voss took one final step forward. Her voice dropped into a low, deadly whisper. "You and your entire unit will report to Veteran Operations Hall at 0600. You will study his missions. You will recite the Marlin Doctrine. And you will understand what humility means before you ever step on my range again." She turned to Callan and in a softer voice asked, "Sir, would you do us the honor of a demonstration?" Tiber Callan didn't respond right away. He looked toward the distant target line, with a shimmer of a ghost target, thermal invisible and AI defeating, hovered behind the brush. He nodded once, and just like that, without uttering a single word, the man who had become a myth took his place behind the rifle he had built with his own hands. The recruits hadn't moved since the general's words had landed like cold steel. The laughter was gone, the bravado drained. What remained was silence, unfamiliar and heavy. Even the wind seemed unsure whether to blow. Tiber Callan lay prone now, body pressed flat against the sand, his cheek resting against the matte blue frame of the Marlin, one rifle like it was a trusted friend. His gloved hand curled around the grip, not with the twitchy energy of youth, but with the smooth, controlled precision of someone who had done this long before most of them were born. General Raylan Voss remained standing, her boots dug into the gravel, facing the entire firing line. "You should know what you almost trampled," she said. Her voice carried evenly, but underneath it pulsed something cold, almost mournful, because ignorance can be forgiven. Disrespect cannot. She stepped forward, hands clasped behind her back now, more instructor than executioner. "This man," she said, pointing once more to Callan, "is not just a decorated veteran. He's not just a ghost story whispered in advanced recon circles. He's the reason we change how we build doctrine." Merrick Ron stared at her, as if he couldn't reconcile that the same man he had mocked was now being referred to in tones usually reserved for statues and fallen generals. Voss continued. His designation was once known as Operative Polaris, an unsanctioned code name, because even command couldn't explain the outcomes his missions produced. When extraction plans failed, he created them. When equipment jammed, he rebuilt it. When technology fell short, he exceeded it. She gestured toward the target field. 4 decades ago, in the middle of a coastal conflict so deep it was never entered into the public record, a squad was trapped on a crumbling shoreline beneath a marine layer fog bank. Their position was swarmed. GPS failed. Air support couldn't get a lock. They were written off. She turned slowly, letting the gravity build. One man crawled into tidewater, submerged up to his ribs, built a rifle from broken gear, and painted it matte blue so the recovery team could spot him in the surf if he died. And with it, he neutralized every threat. Every shot, invisible to drones, untargeted by heat seekers. Every shot, a rescue flare made from steel. Now it was Brant Halden who looked as though the ground beneath him might give way. His shoulders slumped. "You know why your scopes curve? For humidity drift," Voss said. "Because Callan's field notes from that mission were recovered and reverse-engineered into our current algorithm." She turned to face them directly, her tone no longer harsh, but reverent. "You're not standing near a legend. You're standing in front of your foundation. The man who built your battlefield before you ever walked it." The recruits looked at Callan again, but their eyes had changed. They no longer saw an old man. They saw a monument breathing. Callan adjusted the wind dial on his scope with a movement so gentle it seemed more like memory than mechanics. He inhaled slowly, and the entire line seemed to hold its breath with him. "Let me be clear," Voss added. "Everything you laughed at today, the bolt-action rifle, the color, the silence, that was once the last light on a coastline where everyone else had given up. That rifle wasn't painted blue because it looked pretty. It was painted blue because he intended for it to be found after he was gone." The recruits looked down at their own weapons, sleek, over-designed, thermal pulse systems they barely understood. And it hit them like cold seawater. They had never built anything with their own hands. never relied on breath instead of ballistic software, never fired for a purpose greater than score. Voss gave them a moment longer. Then she turned to Callan. "Sir," she said gently, "the line is yours." Callan made no grand gesture. He didn't wink, didn't smile. He simply aligned the reticle with something they couldn't even see and began the quiet ritual that only those who have known true solitude understand. And the range, for the first time that morning, felt holy. Tiber Callan lay in the prone position, every breath measured, every muscle relaxed in a way that defied his years. His body had become one with the sand, his torso fused to the earth like it had always belonged there. The recruits stood behind him now, no longer mocking, no longer speaking. They were silent, reverent, like parishioners inside a cathedral made of mist, dust, and distant echoes of war. Downrange, beyond the outer berm, sat a target none of them could see. It was a test dummy cloaked in a new generation of stealth-mimicking camouflage, a mobile thermal invisible drone core positioned 4,200 meters out, hidden behind a false stone outcropping and designed to evade both satellite sync and AI-enhanced rangefinders. No trainee had ever hit it. Some couldn't even locate it. Even the best marksmen on base had declared it unsolvable without software overlays or drone assistance. Callan had no such help. He adjusted the dial on his hand machine scope. No cliques, no beeps, just the whisper of internal gears turning under calloused fingertips. His eyes narrowed. He wasn't looking through glass. He was reading light. General Voss stepped back, her hands folded behind her, face unreadable. Colonel Wren stood beside her now, his arms at his sides. Neither spoke, neither breathed. Callan gently pressed his cheek tighter to the stock of the Marlin one. Private Merrick Ron, who earlier had poked the rifle with a smirk, now stood frozen behind the firing line. His shoulders hunched, his lips pressed tight. He hadn't blinked in 20 seconds. The wind shifted again. It was almost imperceptible, a few molecules pushing east instead of west. But Callan adjusted. Not the rifle, his body. The tiniest shift in elbow placement. A slight bend of the wrist. The rifle became an extension of his rib cage, of his heartbeat. The moment stretched. Then Callan exhaled, just once, long and slow, like he was releasing a memory, and pulled the trigger. The sound was quiet but final. Not loud, not theatrical. Just a clean crack that split the silence like a truth too long unspoken. Everyone turned toward the distant hill, but saw nothing. No explosion, no puff of smoke, no ping, just wind. 10 seconds passed, then 20. A few of the recruits exchanged uncertain glances. Had he missed? Was it just a ceremonial gesture? Then, on the far right edge of the range, a monitor near the command observation deck blinked. A single green LED lit up. Then a second monitor flickered to life. Then a third. They displayed the impossible, a 100% confirmation. Direct impact. Bullseye. Center mass. Thermal target eliminated. All without optics. Without drones. Without code. Only sight. Only breath. Only the blue rifle. A gasp traveled through the crowd. Not just awe, but confusion. Because it wasn't just a great shot. It was an impossible one. Lieutenant Brant Halden staggered back half a step. It felt as though the foundation of his training had cracked. He had just witnessed something that algorithms couldn't explain. Callan said nothing. He slowly pulled back the bolt, ejecting the spent casing into his gloved hand. The brass clicked lightly against his palm. He studied it like an old friend, then gently slid it into the pouch sewn onto his vest. Behind him, General Voss spoke again, this time softly, not to command, but to mark the moment. "Gentlemen," she said, "that is what the battlefield looked like before you were born." She stepped toward Callan. "That is not a relic. That is a masterwork, and you are standing in its presence." Callan finally sat up. He didn't grandstand. He didn't gloat. He simply slung the rifle over his shoulder with practiced ease and looked downrange one last time, as if checking to see if the target had learned its lesson. Then he turned and began to walk away, and no one dared to speak. The walk back from the line felt longer than it was. Tiber Callan didn't stride. He didn't limp. He simply moved with the unhurried rhythm of a man who had spent a lifetime outpacing both death and applause. The marlin, one hung across his back like a memory, carried gently. The painted blue steel gleamed faintly under the thinning fog, and with every step, the dust seemed to part for him. General Voss stood in respectful stillness as he passed. Colonel Wren followed suit, nodding faintly, his lips pressed in a line that said more than words could. Neither of them had to speak. Callan had already said everything with that single shot. The recruits remained frozen. Some still stared downrange. Others looked at their boots. No one dared make eye contact with Callan as he walked by. Not out of fear, out of shame. Brant Halden was the first to move. He stepped forward slowly, like a man returning to a crime scene. His jaw was tight. His voice, when it came, was stripped of all the officer school bravado, all the posture, all the polish. It was raw, honest. "Sir," he said. Callan stopped. Brant swallowed. "Mr. Callan," he corrected. I need to apologize properly. There's no excuse for how I acted earlier. I saw you, but I didn't see. I heard you weren't speaking, and I assumed silence meant irrelevance. I was wrong, deeply wrong." The recruits behind him watched in silence. Callan turned, his expression unreadable at first. Then his eyes softened, not with approval, not with warmth, but with something weightier, recognition. As if he was staring not just at a junior officer, but at himself decades ago, before the storms had taught him patience. He stepped forward until they were eye to eye. Then he spoke for the first time all day. "Respect," he said, his voice quiet but crystalline, "isn't in what you say when someone's watching. It's in what you withhold when no one is." Brant nodded, absorbing it. Callan continued. "You don't need to carry the biggest rifle," he said. "You don't need to shout the loudest orders. But you do need to remember who built the ground you're standing on. Because one day, someone younger than you will forget. And it'll be your turn to remind them, with grace." Brant blinked back something in his eye. Private Ron stepped forward now, his face red with humility. "I mocked your rifle, sir," he said, voice low. "Called it a toy. I didn't know." Callan turned to him and nodded once. "Now you do." He paused, then added, "And that makes you responsible." The recruits looked at each other, their previous smirks now long gone. What they had dismissed as eccentricity was mastery. What they had ridiculed as color was courage. And the silence they had interpreted as weakness had been the deepest kind of control. General Voss stepped forward again. "Callan," she said, "you've given them a lesson no manual could teach. But if you be willing, Veteran Operations Hall is creating a permanent exhibit on foundational doctrine. We'd be honored if you'd let us archive your Marlin 1 after you're ready." Callan chuckled softly. "I'm not done with it yet," he said. "But one day," he turned back toward the far end of the range, gazed distant. "When it no longer has one more shot in it, or I don't." Brant bowed his head slightly, not an official gesture, just human. That evening, the recruits were ordered to Veteran Operations Hall by 0600, but none of them waited. Most showed up hours early. Some began reading through old doctrine files on their tablets. Others looked up mission reports and thermal fog case studies. Brant, for his part, found a declassified file with a blurry photo of a man submerged in tidewater, rifle resting above the surf, eyes locked on something invisible. The file's author was listed as T. Callan. The title, "Strike Only Once. Breathe Twice." At the bottom of the file, in faded gray text, was a line that hit like a truth none of them could unlearn. "Humility is not surrender. It is the precision of restraint." And for the first time in his life, Brant Halden began to understand the weight of silence and the honor of bearing it. The Fogveil Range was closed for the day. A red notice marked every gate, every entry point. Restricted access. Command demo in progress. No tranis. No noise. No automatic weapons fire. Only silence and the slow assembling of a hand-picked audience. At 0700 sharp, the senior officers began arriving. Colonel Wren stood near the range tower, arms crossed behind his back. General Voss arrived last, stepping out of a matte black convoy SUV with a posture that carried the full weight of her 4 stars. She said nothing as she walked to the edge of the firing line. She didn't need to. They were all waiting for one man. At 0715, Tiber Callan appeared. No entourage. No escort. Just him, walking calmly with his rifle case in one hand, a battered field pouch slung over one shoulder. He wore the same weathered boots, the same faded tan scarf, and the same quiet that had once been mistaken for fragility. But no one mistook him for fragile now. The recruits from Brant Halden's unit stood at parade rest along the back rail. Each of them wore a new patch on their arm, a temporary emblem stitched by order of General Voss herself, a matte blue silhouette of a bolt-action rifle beneath a single word, Polaris. Callan reached the bench and opened his case. The Marlin. One gleamed, its blue frame catching the morning light like a lighthouse beacon in mist. He ran a soft cloth along the barrel, not with urgency, but with affection, like someone polishing a memory. General Voss stepped forward. For the record, she said quietly, this demonstration will not be recorded. No telemetry. No drone footage. This is not for archives. This is for those who thought they knew what a rifle could do, and those who need to remember what the man behind it is capable of. She stepped back. The final target had been placed beyond the ridge, hidden behind terrain and thermal dampening veils. It was a new prototype, a stealth core decoy using reflective disruption to scramble every modern AI system. It wasn't just difficult to see, it was designed to be functionally invisible. It had never been hit. Not once. Callan didn't ask for coordinates. He didn't request wind reports. He just lay prone again, shouldering the rifle with a quiet familiarity that made the silence feel heavier than thunder. His breathing slowed. One breath, then another. Every eye in the audience locked onto him. Not a single sound echoed across the range. Then came a shot. Crack. Soft. Clean. Unremarkable to the untrained ear. The audience turned toward the distant hill, and again saw nothing. But just before disappointment could register, a small light flickered on the edge of the ridge. A drone, watching silently, transmitted a signal to the monitor behind the officers. A single green circle lit up in the center of the screen. Impact confirmed. Dead center. The impossible had just happened again. Gasps broke out quietly. One of the engineers from R&D who'd helped design the stealth core sat down on the ground, stunned. That's not possible, he murmured. Not without adaptive optics. Not without a heat signature. But it had happened. Without software. Without tech. Without anything but a man, a breath, and a blue rifle. Callan stood. General Voss walked toward him, extended her hand. Thank you, she said, voice barely above a whisper. But he didn't shake it. He just nodded, then turned to the audience. And for the first time that day, he spoke loud enough for all of them to hear. You don't shoot to prove, he said. You shoot to preserve. He slung the rifle over his shoulder and walked toward the transport vehicle waiting nearby. The audience parted for him like a tide breaking against a rock. As he passed Brant Halden, the lieutenant raised his hand in a slow salute. Callan didn't return it. Instead, he stopped for just a breath and said, "Make it count. One day, you'll be the one holding silence." Then he left. No ceremony, no medals, just a whisper in the wind that carried longer than any round fired that day. Later at dusk, someone etched a simple phrase into the steel siding of the range tower, just above the viewing deck. No name, no title, only this. Before you speak, look downrange. And for every recruit who ever trained at Fogveil after that day, the story wasn't told by instructors or manuals. It was told by the way the wind paused, by the way silence was respected, by the memory of the shot they still talk about.